Hi everyone, my name is Justin Lake from Think Numbers, and today we're going to be talking about a few different ratios when you look at a balance sheet to actually calculate some liquidity ratios and some solvency ratios. So the liquidity ratios are all about understanding your current assets and converting this to cash and its ability to pay the short-term debt. So the couple of the ratios that we're going to look at are the current ratio as well as the quick ratio. And we're also going to look at a solvency ratio called the debt to equity ratio. And what that actually looks at is takes your total liabilities and divides that by your total owner's equity to actually come up with your ability of how much debt is actually in the business versus equity. So let's start with the liquidity ratios, and we're going to look at the current ratio. So the formula for current ratio is current assets divided by current liabilities. And if we look at this particular balance sheet, you can actually get the current assets by looking at, there's a subtotal there called current assets, and this is everything that is under 12 months to be converted to cash. So if we put that number in of 73,900 and you divide that by short-term current liabilities, so 50,450, and what you actually then do is you calculate the two of these numbers, and what you end up getting is a ratio of 1.46. And what that means is we have almost 1.5 times the amount of assets, current assets, compared to the amount of current liabilities. So we're actually in a relatively healthy position. We've got more assets that can be used to pay for our short-term debt. Now, let's now look at the quick ratio. And the difference with this ratio is that it looks at most of the current assets, but it looks at cash plus marketable securities plus your accounts receivable. And then it divides it all by your current liabilities. Now, the main difference, the reason why you would exclude prepaid rent and inventory is because that is not necessarily a given that can be converted into cash as easily as an accounts receivable, because the accounts receivable has already been sold and it's an invoice awaiting collection. And so inventory, you still have to sell it to a customer, and prepaid rent, it's not money that you can recover back because you've paid that up in advance. So let's actually work this out, and we'll see the difference between this ratio versus the current ratio. So if we have, in this case, cash of 32,800, there are no short-term marketable securities, and there's also an accounts receivable balance. So that amount equals 33,100. And then the current liabilities is still 50,450. So we have 33,100 divided by 50,450. And this amount works out to be only 0.65 times. So it's actually significantly less compared to the current ratio. So really that means for every dollar of liabilities, we only have 65%, you could almost say, or times, of assets to cover. And the thing is, the reason for that is because there's such a significant amount of inventory in these current assets. And by excluding it, you only look at really the cash and the accounts receivable. So in this case, it's not as in a good position as it appeared when we first looked at the current ratio. Okay, so now we're going to look at the debt to equity ratio. And the debt to equity ratio is your total liabilities divided by your owner's equity. So let's have a look at the figures and see and what this is actually measuring is how much debt is in the business versus equity. And if there's too much debt, that can actually be quite high risk, because it means then you've got to service the interest, and compared to if you've got shareholders where they're more relying on growth, capital growth, or dividends. So let's have a look. The figures are 149,950 divided by owner's equity of 21,950. So let's see what this ends up being. 149,950 divided by 21,950 It's a significant number. It's 6.83 times. So that means we've got a significant amount more debt in the business compared to equity. And you can see that there's a huge amount of long-term debt. Majority of it is long-term debt. And there's also a significant amount of accounts payable. So in this case, it's a significant number. And I mean, if you're interpreting this number, in practice, you should be only looking at a number of maybe 60 to 70% of the business having a debt to equity ratio of 65% to 70 is considered on the higher end. So a number at this sort of scale is off the charts, and you would be really raising the alarm bells that this business is funded by way too much debt compared to how much equity is in the business. But anyway, that's how you would approach these type of questions and how you would be able to read a balance sheet. I hope you've enjoyed the lecture, and I hope to see you in some of my other videos.